Oh, wait, come and get the kisses. Oh, hello. Hello. Hello, everybody. Steve, the amateur historian. How y'all doing today? It's another beautiful day in the Portland area, and I wish I could get out more, but we're all making sacrifices here. And while amidst quarantining myself, there's a gentle wind blowing this way, and my microphone's right here. I hope it's not going to screw with the audio. But while in the midst of quarantining ourselves, I, just for fun, want to do just a series of videos on interesting things that have happened. Probably a lot of them in the Portland area, but I'm certainly not restricting it to that. I'm restricting it to Oregon as a whole, but, you know, I may go outside of the Portland area. Sorry, I had to change the direction my camera was facing. The wind was coming this way, my camera was like this, and it was starting to make it want to tip a little bit. But for today's story, we go back to 1974, and outside of Portland, primarily. Hence my reference to, not going to necessarily just always be in Portland with these stories, but this is the story of what has become known as the Beavercreek Bomber, which is not a nickname for an athlete. It was the nickname for a mystery, presumably a mystery individual, mystery man, who was stirring up a lot of issues in the fall of 1974. To get things started, right around the start of October, there was a helicopter doing patrols over the power lines. You go out to rural places, there's the big steel towers running power lines this way, that way, this way, all over the place. And, you know, it's running power from, you know, primary locations where it's being generated from. In this case, it was Bonneville Dam up on the Columbia River, just a ways east of the Portland area. And while this helicopter was out there doing its runs, it did notice that it appeared the bases of a few of these towers had been severely damaged. The towers were still standing, but something had happened. Some explosive had been put next to them or something, and it was strange. The towers were still standing. It was strange, but, you know, whatever. We move on. We'll get the towers fixed. So then you fast forward a couple of weeks. It's like mid-October now, and out of nowhere, there's this series of massive explosions that occur near the vicinity of Mount Hood, like kind of near the base. And, you know, nobody knew what they were. These massive explosions. People who lived nearby, they felt their windows rattling and things like that. So, of course, authorities set out to figure out what the hell is going on. And they pretty quickly figured out what had happened. They had discovered there were 5 explosions in total, and they discovered that dynamite had been... This is another story I'm doing that involves dynamite. Dynamite had been placed, you know, at the base of some of these big towers running these power lines. And 3 of them was completely toppled over. The base was blown out and they just came down. And the other ones were, you know, severely damaged. Power lines were coming down. Forest fires were getting sparked. It was a big, chaotic mess. And, of course, it took the power down because these were lines coming straight from Bonneville Dam. And, you know, it was crazy. It was strange, but they were able to handle it. They were able to, you know, get the towers fixed. They were able to run the power lines another way to pass that time so they could get things fixed. They got the fires put out, thank God. But, you know, if that initial discovery of these, the helicopters, operators seeing these damaged, kind of the supports to these big towers, and then a couple weeks later, all of a sudden, obviously, towers are being brought down again. All of a sudden, you have to think, what the hell is going on? Who is doing this and why? Well, they didn't have to wait too long for that, because within 48 hours of these massive explosions happening, the FBI receives a letter from a guy who only describes himself as J. Hawker. Not J. Hawker as the word, but J. Hawker. Like, I don't know, Jerome Hawker. And I guess it was in reference to Jay Hawkers, which I only saw it briefly, but I guess that was a kind of a revolutionary group, organization, whatever you want to call it, that was functioning kind of out of the kind of Missouri, Kansas area. And of course, Kansas is known as kind of being the Jayhawk. I don't know if they're called the Jayhawk State, but like, I know their University of Kansas their mascot is a Jayhawk, but that was the name he was using. But anyway, Jayhawker sends the FBI a letter and essentially says, pay me the amount of $1 million, or, trust me. Essentially, it was a threat, like, you're going to face more than $1 million worth of damage if you don't comply. And Jayhawker in the letter stated, we have the resources, we have the manpower to continue doing what has happened. Obviously, he was taking advantage for these damages that occurred and saying, we have the power to do a lot worse if you don't comply with us. They even threatened, saying, if you send out anybody after us to try to find us, we'll kill them. So this guy was not joking around. And of course, the FBI's policy is you don't pay terrorists. And I mean, you could argue that this was kind of a weak form of domestic terrorism and extortion, trying to get ransom money out of it. So they told the Bonneville Power Administration, who of course, ran Bonneville Dam and was responsible for these these towers that were coming down, don't pay the ransom. And they didn't do that. And so after some time passed, Jayhawker sent another letter out because, well, he's probably pissed. At least that would be what you might want to take away from it. And this time it said, send me my $1 million now, or he threatened to damage the Bull Run Reserve. Or it's a reservoir. Essentially, it's the location where the Portland area gets most of its drinking water. So he was threatening to screw with our water supply, is what it comes down to. And fortunately, that never came to pass. But then, a little later on, like 2 days later, because I believe Jayhawker sent a total of like 6 different letters. And he sent another one right after this threat against the Bull Run Reservoir. He sent one to the FBI trying to set up a mode of communication. I guess the letters weren't getting it done, and he actually wanted a method to directly communicate with the FBI while not making it known who he was. And so he set up a CB radio channel, Channel 9, on the radio to communicate. And when they communicated, in order to keep them from, recording his voice, identifying his voice, Jayhawker would repeatedly use a duck call. Like, while he was talking, he would have this duck call squawking while he talked. That's the method of preventing the authorities from knowing who he was, or from identifying his voice. And this, unfortunately, was the undoing of the Beavercreek Bomber, because what he likely didn't know was authorities were, tracking where his CB radio signal was coming from, because they had enough information to do that. And they had literally tracked his radio to somewhere in the southeast Portland area, which, hey, that's where I live. So the Beavercreek Bomber was driving around my hood, and so the FBI sent agents out all over southeast Portland. They were just permeating this area. And one agent in particular was driving behind a 68 Plymouth while the Beavercreek Bomber was apparently communicating with the FBI, and he started hearing these duck calls. He was hearing the duck calls that the bomber was using, and he thought he heard them from in front of him, from this Plymouth. And so he starts, taking a look at the guy in front of him, and he realizes the guy's also got like a walkie-talkie or like a radio in his hand. What are the odds that just some random guy is driving around with a duck call that he's using, while He's got a radio that can, be used as a CB radio, and he just happens to be driving around Southeast Portland. The odds were actually, despite the fact that it seemed like this officer just randomly ending up behind this car where this stuff was happening, the long shots of that, it actually was pretty likely that they would stumble onto him, and it was very likely that whoever was driving this Plymouth was the guilty party. So this officer pulled the car over, and there was actually a husband and wife inside. David and Sheila Heesch. Their last name is spelled Heesch, so I'm thinking it's Heesch. Makes sense. And, the officer sees the radio, he sees the duck call, and they have enough to search this couple's home. And this couple actually, which is perfectly set up, they actually lived in Beavercreek, which is kind of a small community kind of wedged between Oregon City and Molalla. It's kind of getting out to the sticks. Like, you've just left the fringes of the Portland metropolitan area, and it's getting very rural. I've actually filmed a lot of movies out in that area, and not necessarily Beavercreek so much. I don't know, the crazy girl I took to prom, she technically lived in the Beavercreek area. But Beavercreek, Estacada, Molalla, it's all kind of, down over here. And it's always been just kind of regarded as an area that, like, strange things happen and crazy people come from. I'm not necessarily saying that, this couple fit into that dynamic, but it was just, considering what was happening, it was so perfect that these people lived in this general area. I mean, Estacada, a couple years ago, you had a guy who went to a local thriftway store with a knife. He murdered his wife and he murdered his mother and literally walked into the store with the head of his mother in his hands and went after one of the guys that worked there with a knife. Like, that happened in Estacada, and like every friend I've ever had who lived in the Molalla area has said that they just constantly were sketched out living in there. Again, I'm not saying that the Heesches apply to that dynamic necessarily, but it just, for the story, it fit that they lived in this area. And once they were caught, they actually accepted that they were busted. They didn't try to fight it. David pled guilty. He was, the primary brains behind it, so he was pretty much held responsible as the bomber, even though he had assistance from his wife Sheila. And he wanted to make a point when he pled guilty to say, like, there's not a bunch of other unaccounted for explosives out there, nothing more is going to happen. And he received a 20-year sentence for, blowing up some towers. And his wife received a 10-year sentence as an accessory. And they actually served very briefly. I think David served 5 years and Sheila served 11 months. And I think it was determined pretty quickly, despite the severity of what they had done, that these weren't deranged lunatics. These weren't people that were trying to go out and be revolutionaries. And later on, when she was interviewed, Sheila said that essentially, they were young and they were desperate. David had just lost his job. They were probably struggling financially. They had a family to take care of, and it drove them to commit this desperate act. I guess David kind of, he didn't want his family to have to struggle. He didn't want his children to have to struggle, and he wanted to spend more time with his family. And I think he thought, we'll do this one thing that's big and dramatic, but they're not going to, like, kill anybody in the process. They didn't go out and murder a bunch of people. They knocked down some power poles, and we're probably hoping to get that reward money so that they would be financially stable in the aftermath. It was a crazy idea and a crazy plot that probably wasn't going to work. But that was their main motive, it was a crazy plan hatched out of desperation from a family suddenly struggling. These were not crazy, out of their mind terrorists. And so that's kind of the twist at the end of the story, is that these weren't total lunatics. These were legitimately everyday people like you and me, who in the aftermath acknowledged that what they were doing was nuts. But still, just what a crazy story. Just one day, October 1964, like I keep wanting to say power poles because that's what we have. But like towers just start going down, and you're getting letters from people saying, we got the men and we've got the power and we're going to do more if you don't listen to us. I think it was just, they were just going to take to drastic actions. They were going to do actions to appear credible, and then they were going to threaten to do other things to incite hopefully enough fear to get their money. And it makes sense in the end when you think like they demanded money after these towers went down, and they got a little bit more aggressive demanding it, threatening to, damage our water supply, which of course never happened. And it was just trying to do just enough to get the money, and then they could fade off into obscurity and hopefully never be identified. And I think the fact that it wasn't working and they weren't getting their money drove them to have to do more and more things, and eventually setting up this radio channel that was essentially their undoing. But just a wild story from 1970s Oregon Americana. This couple from Beavercreek, one of them knew his way with dynamite, and they just came up with an idea of how to get money and did their best. And I guess fortunately and unfortunately it didn't quite work out for this couple. But after they got out of prison, they went on with their lives. I don't think they blew anything else up after that. And David passed away, I believe, in 2006. And in the article I read, Sheila was still alive. So I think they were in their mid-30s. So they would have been born around 1940. So Sheila would be, around 80 now if she is still alive. They managed to pick up the pieces and seemingly go on with their lives in the aftermath of this one brief foray. I can't say the word. Yeah, foray into low-level domestic terrorism. Again, if you can call it that. Technically it qualified as that, but I don't qualify them as terrorists. And that is the story of the 1974 Beavercreek Bomber and his wife accomplice. They went out and did things together. So yeah, it's a crazy story. The FBI probably doesn't think it's as funny as I do. But as long as people aren't dying and it happened a really long time ago, I can laugh about it a little bit. So thanks so much for watching. And again, stay safe. Don't be stupid. Don't be going out when you don't have to. And as always, remember to like, share, subscribe, comment, whichever of those you want to do. You want to do all of them, that's fine. And I'm sorry that I suck so horribly at checking comments. I usually check them at work, and now that I'm not at work, I just haven't really been checking them that regularly in general, so I apologize. I'm a terrible comment-checking YouTuber. But, none of us are perfect, as this story probably showed you. And, thank you again so much for watching. Until next time, this has been Steve, the Amateur Historian.